perhaps people who are on our team could raise their hand and wave, and you'll see who's been working on this series. The Latin America Caucus of Interfaith Council has been working since the 1980s to educate and motivate to action people around here in whatever ways we can, working on human rights issues and militarism and the political and economic policies of the United States toward Latin America. And here we are in 2022, and we're still working with a difficult landscape to be looking at after so many years of trying to work toward justice and peace. I think that that you might have heard that we are recording this session. If for any reason you do not want your image on the recording, you can take yourself off of video, but it'll be great to have this to use at other times. And we thank our speaker tonight for agreeing to letting that be useful to us. It's important to note that we have three co-sponsors this evening, and we are quite grateful to them. One is the University of Michigan Latin America and Caribbean Studies Department, and they are very generously helping to subsidize this series. We also have the Wayne State University Center for Latinx Studies, and we have the DSA of Ann Arbor, the Democratic Socialist Organization. So that's who we are. I would like, before we get started, to remind you all, you must have seen it somewhere that interested you in coming tonight, but this is our speaker series of 2022, and we will meet the second Tuesday of every month from January through May to have a speaker that will shed some light on topics related to these issues that I've mentioned. I will just tell you what is happening in February, which is that Lisa Haugard from LAG, Latin America Working Group in Washington, DC, will join us, and she'll talk about the Biden administration's approach to the northern countries of Central America, the places where most of our refugees have been coming to our southern border from. And is it going to be different than the Trump policies? Please tune in. So those of you who are interested both in root causes of migration and migration and border issues, as well as human rights in Latin America, will want to tune in. So tonight's speaker will be introduced very shortly by my colleague, and we'll give a presentation of about 40 to 45 minutes. And he has a wonderful PowerPoint presentation. And if during that time you have questions or comments that you would like to put forth, you can put those in the chat. Rebecca will be collating those questions, and you can also wait till after the talk, and there'll be time to put them in the chat. But then we will have a nice period of question and answer. And John is particularly good at thinking on his feet, so there should be a lively discussion, I would think. So without further ado, Jennifer will introduce our speaker tonight, and please enjoy.
Thanks a lot, Marianne. I'm Jennifer Jones, a member of the Latin America Caucus of ICBJ and co-chair of the Huron Valley DSA. I have long been aware of the deadly yet legal U.S. government's arming and training of foreign military and police, and I I went to the School of the Americas Watch, their first encuentro in 2016, and there I attended a workshop about US guns in Mexico and became aware of the illegal flow of guns to Mexico. And John Lindsay-Poland coordinates the Stop US Arms to Mexico, a project of global exchange. John has written about, researched, and organized action for human rights and demilitarization of US policy for more than 30 years. His research has focused on the relationship between foreign military assistance and respect for human rights, foreign military bases, and military spending. He is currently co-director of the California Healing Justice Program of the American Friends Service Committee. And recently, he has begun developing tools and curriculum for researching militarism on behalf of activist campaigns. I am so happy to have John Lindsay-Poland with us tonight.
Well, thank you so much, Jennifer. It's really great to be with you all, albeit virtually. I know during the pandemic, it's been really challenging for a lot of people, for many of us, to adapt to this virtual medium and connecting with each other and learning and being in solidarity and taking action. So I really appreciate the commitment that it takes to do it this way. And I noticed that from some of the people who introduced yourselves in the chat that people come to this particular topic both through your own studies or your life experiences. And hope we'll get a chance to, I really look forward to a chance to have some conversation that draws on that or whatever kind of questions come up. I've been doing work against US militarism for quite a while, since the early 80s, and really became much more engaged on the issues of US sourced firearms in Mexico around 2010 and 11, when violence in Mexico was particularly growing, and took part in a caravan in 2012 with family members of people who had been forcibly disappeared, either by state forces or by criminal organizations. And it was such a powerful experience to be with people, and I think many of you have had this experience too, or may have be in that situation yourself of being a survivor of violence. When people who have been through these situations and still carry them and decide to speak out, to resist, to seek change, to create community, to take action, it's a very powerful and inspiring experience to accompany. And so I looked for what is it, what can I do? What am I any good at? And I'm a researcher by temperament. I'm an organizer, but also a researcher. I like to dig into the data, as you will see, and I also like to understand from people's life experiences, what does that mean? How does that actually translate in life? And so I just began to start looking at, well, where are the sources of these firearms that are being used? And it's not only true of Mexico, right? I mean, throughout the world, people, when they talk about the arms trade, they often focus on the really big ticket items like jet fighters, things that are very expensive. But in fact, around the world, in political violence, in armed violence, in criminal violence, it is firearms, it is small arms that are the vehicle, the instrument for more deaths and suffering than any other material instrument of warfare. So I'm going to go through a whole lot of stuff. And I guess one thing I do want to say is that this knowledge, this information is not easy to carry. And from my perspective, when we learn things, it's really important to figure out what to do with that information. Because it's toxic, right? We are working with information about how people hurt each other really badly. And so when we take in that information, I think it's super important to think about how we're going to use it. And in effect, how we're going to transform it. Because if not, it just stays inside, and that toxicity can actually harm us. So that's kind of my appeal to you at the outset, is to always be thinking about, okay, what can I do with this? So I'm going to share my screen here. And we're going to talk about both the illegal trade, as Jennifer said before, as well as legal exports of firearms to Mexico and Central America, particularly to Mexico. And so those tend to run along different tracks. They all become the same toxic cocktail, right? They all contribute to this really very difficult situation for people in Mexico and Central America. But they often have different mechanisms and different policy remedies. And people the politics of them tend to be different. We can talk about that more later. So let's look a little bit just about what is the reality. Since the drug war was declared in 2006, hundreds of thousands of people have been killed in Mexico with firearms. Just in the last decade, more than 200,000. And when most of these people are now being killed with firearms. 20 years ago, the proportion of people in homicides with firearms was about 25%. So as more firearms have come into the country, more and more of those murders are occurring with firearms. And there's also been this enormous wave of forced disappearance, both by state forces and by criminal forces. So that's a crime that doesn't end, right? Because the family members don't recover the remains of their loved ones and don't know what happened. The person could still even be alive. And so the crime is a continuing crime, and often one that is very, very difficult to heal. And Mexico has been the country in which in recent years there have been more forced disappearances than other countries in the Americas. Now, so this is just and I have my screen, be able to see my screen. This is the number of gun homicides in Mexico. Now, according to data, very consistent data from the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, of the illegal weapons that are recovered in Mexico, consistently 70% of them are sourced to the United States. Of the remaining 30%, some are just unknown and some are sourced to other countries. And you can see that there is a very significant correlation in these numbers between two things. One is in 2004, the federal assault weapons ban in the United States expired. And the number of assault weapons flowing from the United States into Mexico grows enormously. 2 to 3 years later, Mexico declares a drug war against organized crime with support from the United States in what became known as the Mérida Initiative. And the number of firearms deaths, homicides, also goes up. Very, very significant over that time, because well, we can talk about more about why that was. I'll come back to that. Now, the United States has its own very serious gun violence problem, and a lot of that is being sourced by the firearms market, which is so open. And when you take a look at the number of firearms dealers, so in this particular graphic, the black pistol icons represent the number of licensed firearms dealers per city, per town or city in the US border states. And the red pistol icons represent the number of firearms recovered per city in Mexico. And you can see that this is just an enormous number of firearms dealers, and we'll look closer at what happens near the border in Mexico. But that's where they're coming from. People buy them at gun shops. It's very easy to traffic them over the border. So when we look at where in the United States these are coming from, most of them are coming from the US border states. Texas being the number one source. About 42% of the recovered firearms that are traced back to the United States were purchased in Texas. And then California and Arizona are the next highest source states, with other US states being a smattering of sources. Now, one of the important things here is that you can buy a firearm in many US states, a majority of US states, without a background check. So the Ann Arbor Congresswoman, Debbie Dingell, is in favor and is a co-sponsor of federal legislation that would require a background check for any purchase, not just from a federally licensed dealer. So this was on a trip just before the pandemic started. I took a trip to Texas, and we went outside of San Antonio to a gun show. This was outside and inside. And in this gun show, there were some people who were federally licensed dealers. They had to run a background check on any buyer. But there were also people who did not have a federal license to sell firearms, but they could anyway. They could because Texas doesn't require it. And this picture on the left is that firearm on the right-hand side is a 50 caliber sniper rifle on sale for about $11,000. And you didn't need you didn't have to pass a background check, which means that if you had a felony, or even if you had a driver's license, but you were not a citizen, or you were not 18, or, like there were any number, but particularly anybody who, in the US context, the reason why we have this is like, we don't want to be selling guns to people who have a history of domestic violence, for example, or who have other types of violent histories. So, but that doesn't apply if you're not a federally licensed dealer in most US states. So this weapon that I just showed you is of particular interest because it's something that organized crime wants to use. A 50 caliber rifle can fire up more than a mile. There's instances of it taking down a helicopter. They can penetrate armor, whether it's like an armored vehicle or body armor on a law enforcement agent or anyone else. And so criminal organizations in Mexico, they want to control territory, right? So the more territory they can control, the more money they can make from any number of the trades, legal and illegal, that they control. And in order to control territory, you want military assets. And so this is a really great military asset that is available in I believe it's all but Washington, D.C., California, Connecticut, and Maryland to any buyer, to any legal buyer. So that's a particular piece I'll come back to when we talk about what can be done. So when we look at the border, you can see graphically. So these is kind of a zoom in on that map I showed you before, which is on our website. And there are these small little towns near the border in the Rio Grande Valley and all along the border that have multiple firearms dealers, gun dealers. And you can also see that there's lots and lots of guns being recovered right over the border. The criminal organizations want to control the territory near the US border because the closer to the United States that you get with an asset like narcotics, or even like people who are being who are migrating and who are paying to get over the border, the more it's worth, right? The more money they can make, the closer to the border. And so there's this mix of the U.S. migration policies and the gun policies, which is especially harmful and dangerous. You have in some of these firearms dealers near the border, they're selling tactical weaponry, and they make no bones about it. It's legal, and so this is from one place in the corner there. You can see another 50 caliber weapon leaned up against the wall. There are 20 licensed firearms dealers just 15 miles from the border in this particular town. And I want to, sometimes people focus just on the firearms, but the so-called accessories, the magazines, as well as the ammo are also very important, right? Because if you have a firearm, but you can't resupply it, then you're not going to be able to use it. And there are many of these high capacity magazines which are used together with assault weapons for a high rate of fire. Again, in order to be able to fight a criminal organization or to fight state forces, they want more firepower. And so high capacity magazines are particularly important for that. Another example of this is ammo that is used for, and it's even advertised as military grade, but used for assault rifles in Mexico and in the US. And I just want to add, this was right before the pandemic. When the pandemic started, you may remember we were only supposed to have essential businesses that were open, and firearms dealers in most states were classified as essential businesses and stayed open. And there was a run on guns in those businesses. Now, a lot of times when people discuss assault weapons in the United States, there is a criticism, because most gun violence in the United States is committed with handguns, and that's very true. While mass shootings are often committed with assault rifles, that is the small minority of gun violence in this country, even though it has a huge impact. And but when we look at Mexico, because of the phenomenon I was just talking about of criminal organizations that are seeking to control territory, the role of assault rifles is quite different, and many more of them are used in gun violence proportionally in Mexico than in the United States. So that a US federal assault weapons ban arguably would have more impact in Mexico than in the United States, which in my mind is an argument for why the Democrats should embrace it more vigorously. Right now, there's a proposed assault weapons ban, and it has almost a majority of House members as co-sponsors, but it never gets to the floor because we know that there's not enough votes, even in the Democrats, to pass it. Now, also a lot of times people focus on the border, and it's crazy. You know, sometimes people would be like, "Oh yeah, John's working on the border." I'm like, you know, this violence is happening throughout the country of Mexico, huge country of Mexico. but the border becomes a focus. And of course, it's a focus for a lot of drama, in part because of so many people who are seeking to come into the United States in very desperate conditions. But the border is also, of course, a site of enormous trade. And this is the structural reason why focusing on the border for stopping gun violence and the flow of guns, illegally trafficked guns into Mexico, is very limited as a strategy, because both countries, the US and Mexico, want to maintain the enormous flow of commerce, of legal commerce over the border. And as you can see from this slide, there's tens and tens of thousands of vehicles that are going from north to south every single day. And I might add that because the US has been controlling the narrative and controlling the assets and the investments of enforcement, most of the enforcement mechanisms are focused on the south to north movement of people and things. So people and narcotics mostly. But the north to south trade is, of course, quite important for the movement of arms, but the infrastructure for enforcement is not focused nearly as much on that. Now, this is not just Mexico, right? This is also Central America, because the number of firearms coming from the United States and going to the so-called Northern Triangle countries is also quite high. Not as high a percentage as in Mexico, but still enormous. And in Central America, it is firearms that are contributing to this unsustainable life for so many communities, so many families, so many young people and parents who they can't stay because of the firearms that have been trafficked, either again by state forces or by illegal forces. Now, and so they come into Mexico, and those migrants who come into Mexico are confronting armed violence with firearms that are coming from the United States. So, sometimes, when we talk about the Remain in Mexico program, or that somehow people seeking asylum or going to apply for asylum in Mexico, we have to also count into this the role of firearms in Mexico that make it impossible for migrants to stay. And when I gave the figures before about the number of people who have been forcibly disappeared in Mexico, a very large number of those people were migrants, people who were seeking to move through Mexico, but didn't make it through. Now, some of you have, I'm sure, heard about the lawsuit. It's an historic lawsuit. We can talk more about it. In my mind, it is an excellent move by Mexico. Mexico in August filed a lawsuit in a federal court in Massachusetts against 11 gun producers, companies, and distributors, including among the largest ones in the United States. And this shifts the focus in part away from the border, right? I mean, but it puts the focus on the gun companies that are making a ton of money from both illicitly trafficked weapons as well as from legally exported weapons. And I think that's a super important move, apart from whatever happens in the courts, which I think it does have a good chance of succeeding, if not in changing the marketing practices or in a financial award to Mexico, which is what they're seeking in this lawsuit, then in the discovery phase, which could expose the marketing practices of these companies, which would be important for the US gun violence prevention movement as well. But also it changes the politics and the narrative around this issue, which is very important for getting the political will needed in order to address both the illicit trafficking and the problems on legal exports. Now I want to shift to the issues of legally exported firearms. And like I said, this is a somewhat different track, but it all comes together on the ground where people are suffering from the impacts of violence. This is a graph of the number of semi-automatic pistols exported by the United States. And you can see that this has been growing. It grew during Obama's period as well as during Trump's period. And the Trump presidency was indebted to the gun lobby and the gun industry, which gave $30 million to his campaign in 2016. And so the Trump administration enacted an administrative change in gun license exporting to move the oversight of those exports, not just to Mexico, but all over the world, from the State Department, which has responsibility for addressing issues of stability and human rights and even use against US forces, to the Commerce Department, whose mission, of course, is to sell things and export things. And this also substantially loosened the regulations on those gun exports and gun export licenses. This is and this was enacted in March of 2020, again at the beginning of the pandemic, and did have an immediate result in increased exports over the second 6 months of 2020. It kind of leveled out in 2021, but you can see that the number of exports, again, this is of military long guns, but which has increased historically over the last 20 years, and then has increased again during that period of the new export licensing regime. This is a graph of just the exports of firearms to Mexico. Again, these are legal exports. And you can see that when the Merida Initiative begins in order to implement the drug war in 2008, the number of firearms exported to Mexico increases dramatically. Now, when most people talk about the Merida Initiative, which is now dead, both countries acknowledge it's over, the Merida Initiative addressed assistance, not sales. And assistance also has human rights controls on it, including something called the Leahy Law, which is supposed to prevent the assistance of foreign military and police units that have committed gross human rights abuses. The same legislation does not apply to sales. And so even though after a few years of the Merida Initiative, the amount of assistance went down, as you can see from this graph, the number of sales, of exports to Mexico, of firearms, including parts, including bullets and explosives, continue to be quite high, very, very high. Now, where in the United States are these guns coming from? The legally exported ones. This is a map of gun companies that produce guns that are either trafficked illegally into Mexico or are legally exported into Mexico. No significant ones in Michigan. There's a lot in the Southeast, there's a lot in the Southwest, and there's a lot in New England. New England is really the cradle of the American arsenal, and in many ways still is, although some of those companies have been moving to so-called right-to-work states in the South. The union laws are more favorable to them, but also some of the gun laws in New England have become more restrictive, and they've been reacting to that. One of the big exporters to Mexico is a company called Sig Sauer, which is based in New Hampshire. Originally, it's German-owned and still is, but most of its production now takes place in the United States, in New Hampshire. And in 2020, Sig Sauer exported more than 50,000 pistols to the National Guard. The National Guard was formed under the current López Obrador government, and its main mission so far, not its only, but its main mission has been to detain migrants. So when we look at the ways in which migration policy interacts with firearms policy and export policy, this is an important nexus, because the National Guard, together with some other forces within Mexico, is doing the the dirty work of U.S. migration policy by detaining people before they ever get to the U.S. border, so they can't even apply for asylum within the United States. And those people are armed with U.S. guns. Now, the United States is not the only supplier of state forces in Mexico. There are European and Israeli gun companies that also export to Mexico, the biggest one being Beretta in Italy. Beretta also has a US production site. So does Glock. So does 6 Hour. In fact, most of these do. But a lot of these firearms that are going to police who are implicated in collusion with organized crime in many cases, like other parts of the Mexican armed forces. These firearms are also coming from European countries. And it's important to note that Europe has somewhat different gun export policy than the United States. And one of the ways in which European gun companies have been responding to that is by moving more production to the United States. There's a big retail market in the United States for those gun producers, but there's also more lax export laws, as exemplified by that reform in 2020. So here's an example of 6 Hour, German company, didn't really have much US production of firearms, wasn't really selling very many firearms to Mexico. But as it increased its production in the United States, it also increased its exports to Mexico, even after it was criminally charged in Germany for exporting firearms to Colombia. And even after Germany criminally charged another gun company with illegal exports to Mexico, the 6 Hour has been able to continue to sell a lot more firearms to Mexico using the export laws, which are much more lax than they are in Germany. Again, Central American state forces are also being armed with legally exported firearms, not in the same scale as in Mexico, but in Honduras, for example, where the corruption has been sort of off the charts, right? It's really become a drug trafficking government, a kind of a mafia government until the recent election. The police were being armed with legally exported firearms from Colt, based in Connecticut, as well as some other sellers. So the way this comes out on the ground, and I just want to read this quote from this amazing man who is from Mexico, indigenous man from Guerrero, who lives in New York City, and who is the father of one of the 43 people who has disappeared, the student teachers in Ayotzinapa, Guerrero, in 2014, who said, Mexico has acquired exorbitant quantities of weaponry and munitions, and the people at large have no idea of the magnitude of these weapons purchases, which also end up with organized crime. And I think that if you were in my place, in the place of the mothers and fathers of these 43 young men, and knew that these weapons were used in the disappearance of one of your family members, you would be doing the same thing that I am doing. And what is he doing? He holds a run every month in New York for the 43 and invites other people to join him. He joined me at a meeting in Washington, D.C. of an advisory committee to the State Department on weapons exports that is made up almost entirely of the weapons industry, and spoke and said some of the same things to those weapons producers. A very, very inspiring man. So how does it work that these firearms are exported to parts of these state forces that are either implicated in collusion with criminal organizations or are themselves committing human rights abuses directly? This, on the right-hand side, is what's called an end user certificate. And we obtained them through information requests to the Mexican military. And anytime firearms are going to be imported into Mexico, the importer, which is the Mexican army, only the Mexican army is legally authorized to import firearms into Mexico. And they are also the only legally authorized entity to sell firearms in Mexico, whether to police or to private actors. So this is an end user certificate that the Mexican army created, and they sent it to the exporter. The exporter has to get a license from the State Department or the Commerce Department, depending on the type of weapon it is. And we can see in this particular end user certificate that took place in February of 2015. So this is 5 months after the Ayotzinapa disappearances and after state police had already been implicated in that crime, which was internationally denounced. There were protests all over Mexico. There was a so-called investigation. I mean, this was not a quiet crime. And even after that, there were exports to the state police in Guerrero from Colt in Connecticut. And then we can see the thing that goes, what I just showed you. So this goes to the exporter, Colt. What goes to the state, went to the State Department, and again, this is before the regulation change, so everything was going to the State Department. This is a so-called end user certificate, but the only end user named in thousands of these certificates is the Mexican army, not the actual end user, which was the Guerrero police. And because it doesn't name the end user in what goes to the US government, there is no way to apply that same principle of background checks, that we don't want firearms to be going to people who have committed violent crimes. And that's key. And I will come back to that. Now, there are people all over who have suffered. Usually it is very difficult to trace the actual weapons that have been used in a crime. These are family members of a state crime by Tamaulipas State Police, right near the border, like, just over the river from Texas. This was in late 2019. And police came in and seized these people and then said it was a firefight with organized crime. That didn't fly, and some of the police were actually arrested and charged. But even after that, Sig Sauer rifles were sold, and this is a receipt. So this is not an end user certificate. This is a receipt between the Mexican army and the Tamaulipas state government, showing that these Sig Sauer rifles went to those police just 1 month, and between 1 and 3 months after the crime that I just described. The same state police in Tamaulipas is the Mexican state right over the border from the Rio Grande Valley, has a special operations force, and they've gotten US training, and they have been directly armed. This is one of those special ops state police armed with a Sig Sauer rifle. And in January of last year, almost 1 year ago, there were 19 people who were murdered by elements of those state police. Most of them were Guatemalan migrants who had come from the highlands, and the state agents were charged. But again, there was nothing to stop the firearms from going to those agents. And right now, there is still nothing to stop anything from going to those agents. So let's get to what can be done. Right now, there is a bill that is in conference between the House and Senate, which is basically the foreign aid bill. It's a very large bill, 600-700 pages. And in it, the Senate version of that bill would require for Mexico and Central America that the end users of any firearm that is being exported to military or police in those countries be identified to the United States in advance, so that end users can be screened. And it states this in this language. The House did not create this, and so in the conference between the House and Senate versions of this bill, we want the Senate version of this language to prevail, because it would be an important step in being able to actually stop firearms exports from going to any unit that has been implicated in human rights or other types of crimes. The other thing is this regulation change that I mentioned before of semi-automatic and non-automatic firearms exports now being under the oversight of the Commerce Department. When he was a candidate, Joe Biden said he was going to ensure that the authority for firearms exports stays with the State Department. So he made that promise before the rule change. And if needed, reverse a proposed rule. So that rule has now been enacted under Trump, and Biden has done nothing. And what we're hearing is that the White House is saying, well, the if needed means it's only if needed, and we think it's not really needed. That it's okay, it's not that bad. Whereas my reading of the if needed would be if it occurs, if Trump enacts this rule change, then the Biden administration would change the rule, but that has not yet happened. I'm going to skip over this. This was a report, and besides being in Spanish, this was a report about transparency. There are a number of things that we do want to see in U.S. legislation that are a ways away, right? We might need to overturn the rule for the rule for this requires 60 senators, right? So one of these is the so-called TART amendment that prevents sharing data about gun traces, that has been very problematic in addressing gun trafficking, because ATF is actually prohibited by federal law from disclosing a lot of data about weapons that are traced back to the US. And there's some other recommendations that we have in that report too, which the federal assault weapons ban is very important. I think it's the single most important federal gun measure that would impact violence in Mexico. There is a large majority of Democrats in the House that co-sponsor it, but it never gets to the floor because they know it would not pass the Senate. And but that's so it's really about getting more political will, not just from the Republicans, not just winning elections, but also from the Democrats currently in office. And there's a lot of public support already for an assault weapons ban, even in a state like Texas, where you think is super pro-gun. There is at least a plurality in some instances for an assault weapons ban. And so one other thing is to just urge the House Appropriations Committee members to support the Senate version of the Foreign Operations Bill. I can put this in the chat and share it with you all. This is going to be resolved probably by the end of next week. So any kind of action this week that focuses on House appropriators, and they're probably not in your district. I know Debbie Dingell is not on appropriations, would be important. The one other thing I would also want to mention before we open it up is that there is a growing movement in Mexico now operating under this hashtag of Paz Sin Armas and all these different organizations. So groups that are like feminist organizations that are looking at the gender impacts, groups that are focused on organized crime, human rights victims, academic groups, public health and medical associations, church organizations. So there's a lot of more support. And of course, the fact that the Mexican government has filed this lawsuit also makes a big difference. It draws more attention. It focuses a lot of that attention. And so I think there's increasingly, this is a very new, this Paz Sin Armas was just launched in October and is still kind of getting underway. But I think there will be increasing ways for solidarity organizations like ICJJ to become involved and to support folks. And just, if you're looking for more information, our website, Stop US Arms to Mexico, has tons of stuff on it about all the things that I've talked about tonight. And I would encourage you to go there, use what's there. Let us know what you want to do, if there's questions you have, and hoping we can have a conversation.
Thank you so much, John.
The magnitude of the problem is just very sobering.
It sure is.
So if people have questions, you can put them in the chat, and I'm going to turn to Rich for our first question.
John, I know you've written about the arms trade treaty, the international agreement to try to tighten up the flows of illicit arms around the world, which the United States has not ratified. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that.
Right. So the arms trade treaty focuses particularly on small arms, so-called small arms, which include firearms. It has not been ratified by the US, and a lot of it is really focused on transparency, because it's very hard to stop something if you can't see it, if you can't track it, if you can't measure it, if you can't see who are the players. And and Mexico is a signatory, and actually files some decent reports. So there are annual reports that are required under the Arms Trade Treaty, and those can be useful. There's some countries in Europe, for example, that they really file very aggregate information, and so you can't really tell very well what's going on. Sometimes you can get the magnitude, but even in the case of Mexico, which complies with the reporting requirements under the Arms Trade Treaty, the reports rely on what the military is reporting, right? Because the army in Mexico really controls everything about firearms in the country, practically. I mean, the equivalent, the Mexican equivalent of the Department of Justice, the Fiscalia, does have responsibility for illicit firearms that are recovered from crime scenes. But everything else is controlled by the army. And so some of that information is definitely incomplete. So this report on transparency that we issued did look at ATT, Arms Trade Treaty implementation. And, Mexico is exemplary in many ways, but, data like garbage in, garbage out, right? So if what the military is reporting is incomplete, then what is posted will also be incomplete, even if it's very detailed. But it's an important tool. It could be strengthened. But I think it's like whoever said it, the magnitude of the problem is extensive. It's multifaceted. So we really need lots of different strategies and lots of different tools in order to address it. And I would say, don't think you have to take on the whole thing. I may have presented about a lot of different pieces here, but taking on a piece of any of this is useful, because it's only when a lot of different people coming from different places and working on different pieces of it is how we're going to really address the whole, in my opinion.
All right. If you also want to ask your question yourself and not put in the chat, just use the raise hand function. I'm going to turn to Marianne Perron for another question.
Yes, John, could you say a little bit more, and maybe it's just obvious, but what are the interests of the United States, the supposed interests in pushing these arms sales? Is it merely a commerce thing? Is it just, for instance, in the Senate? And why did Trump want to change from the State Department to the Commerce Department? Why do you want to ease it? What is it just for the manufacturers? Is it a different way of controlling what happens in Mexico? Could you speak to that a little bit, please?
Sure. I think there's a few things. The gun lobby is still very powerful. The NRA is in deep crisis, very deep crisis. It's kind of imploding in many ways. But the gun lobby is still very powerful, and a lot of that is the people who the NRA has been, empowering for many years, who are, you're in Michigan. You guys know, what happened last year, and I think a lot of elected officials are afraid of them. They really are. And so there's that. They also do finance elections like the Trump election. I also think that there's a lack of the white supremacy and racism that makes some lives, even within the United States, more gun violence victims more notable or valuable, applies internationally as well. So I think even people who are so-called progressives often shy away from understanding the violence in Mexico as a US gun violence problem. And so that makes it more difficult to educate and get the political will among the policymakers. In foreign policy in general, I mean, this is a kind of thing that straddles domestic and foreign policy. And in foreign policy, it's often very difficult to get members of Congress to take leadership, right? A lot of members of Congress are more likely to leave that to the executive branch. So I do think it's a kind of a combination of things between culture and campaign finance and who actually benefits and ignorance. Of course, the ignorance is something we can work on.
All right. So there's a hand up. I don't see who it is. So just unmute yourself and ask your question.
I think that's me. It's Janet. The question is, do you know what percentage of our economy is represented by these different gun industries? Not talking about military weapons, but just the guns we're talking about. And the other part of what I wanted to mention is something that I learned very recently, which is that on the lower profile issues, and sometimes even on the high profile issues, Debbie Dingell doesn't get more than 15 calls a day. So if you call, they hear you. So.
Yeah, good point. I mean, on that piece, before going back to the first thing, I think there is a question about what is the ask for Debbie Dingell. She's not on, any of the sort of heavy committees on this. She is in the Progressive Caucus, and the Progressive Caucus could be doing more. So, I think educating her would be important, and yeah, letting her know. I think maybe a meeting, apart from a call, getting a meeting with some of her staff would be useful, with Stabenow and Peters as well. In terms of the role of this in the economy, guns are not a big part of the economy. They are, when you compare like a firearm to an F-16 or like, any of these large weapon systems, they're cheap. They're Their technology that there's changes in the production technology, but a lot of it hasn't changed enormously in many years. And I think that's a good thing. And on the one hand, it's problematic because a lot of people can make guns. So the whole ghost gun phenomenon is really problematic because it's easier for anyone to get hold of a gun. But it's not problematic in the sense that the economic task of shifting production is not as great. Now, within the firearms industry, the dependence on firearms that are going to Mexico is significant. There was one study that suggested that of the dealers, not the producers, but of the firearms dealers, more than 40% have some level of dependence on firearms that are purchased with the intent to traffic over the border. So, I think that's but again, those people tend to have a disproportionate larger voice, and people are afraid of them. A lot of people are afraid of them. I do think it's important to make part of the calculus. If the calculus of gun policy and gun legislation is not only what it costs in human terms within the United States, but also what it costs in Mexico and in Central America, then the people who are essentially already favor gun violence prevention policy have even a greater motivation, greater information, more reasons why to enact those things, because it is feeding the flow of forced migration to the United States, because it's so unsustainable to stay in Central America or Mexico.
Thanks. We do have a question in the chat. Anna is asking, how much does decriminalizing drugs in the US help end or reduce the amount of firearms going to Mexico? How much would it help?
Yeah, I think it helps when. So about a month or so ago, the Mexico and the United States came together and said the Merida Initiative is done. We're doing the new thing called the Bicentennial Initiative because it's the bicentennial of U.S. recognition of Mexico. And we're going to focus more on firearms and we're going to focus less on drugs. That's a good thing, I think. But it has to translate into not just decriminalization of consumption, but also how both the United States and Mexico address the commerce in narcotics. And most of decriminalization is focused on marijuana. It has not been focused on methamphetamines. It has not been focused on heroin or cocaine. And that's where more of the money is right now, at least in terms of the criminal organizations. The criminal organizations have also diversified. So they are now in control of a lot of the movement of migrants through Mexico. They're in control of siphoning off of legally produced oil within Mexico. So if you want to affect the gun trade in Mexico, you have to address the source of the weapons, but also the ways in which guns are so attractive to control economies in Mexico, right? The prohibitionist approach to drugs means that you can't resolve a dispute in your industry. You kind of have to use violence, either within a criminal organization or between criminal organizations or between criminal organizations and the state. So the decriminalization contributes to dialing that down, but you need other things as well. You need to address the criminalization of other substances so that there is treatment on demand. If you decriminalize things, but people are still hooked, they're going to find another substance, and that substance is going to find a supply. So there's a lot of, there's a lot of different components that need to be addressed, in my opinion. Of course, decriminalization also reduces harm for people here who would otherwise be incarcerated and whose lives are being destroyed for incarceration, by incarceration for things that should never be penalized.
Thank you. I want to point out that John put his contact information in the chat and also some resources there. There's another question from Rich. He says, it sounds like the Mexican army is serving as a pass-through for the flow of arms to lots of actors, using them for illicit purposes. He wants to know, what is the Mexican army's institutional or economic interest in all of this?
So their institutional interests, there's corruption. I mean, I think that's probably the biggest economic interest, is, the Mexican army controls so much about firearms that they can make money through corruption, individuals within that institution. But I think the bigger interest, it probably is institutional. And it's that they want more control over security in the country. And that's been something that has been occurring not just on this issue. So I mentioned before that the Guardia Nacional, the new National Guard, which replaced the federal police, and it was supposed to be a civilian body. And this is being created by progressive President López Obrador. Supposed to be a civilian body, but it is controlled by the army. The installations are army installations. The personnel are mostly army personnel. The stuff they get is mostly through the army. The doctrine is army doctrine. So, and the AMLO administration is also giving the army more control over heretofore civilian functions, like building a new airport in Mexico City, like responding to the pandemic, like controlling the ports, which has been given over to the Navy. There's more and more of that is going to the army, and at the same time, there's austerity budgets for a lot of the other agencies, not for the military. So I think that the army is using the AMLO administration to get more control within Mexico. And part of that is around firearms. They do not want to give control over firearms. It's probably the only country in the world where one institution controls the importation, the production, the registry, the selling to police, the selling to private actors, the use in operations, the licensing for carry, the recovery of firearms from crime scenes. All of those things, the army. I mean, in a couple of them, they share control with other institutions, but the rest of them, they are the sole institution controlling those things, and they want to keep it that way.
Thanks. And we have another question from Judith. Why hasn't the Biden administration moved to restrict the flow of small arms to Mexico?
Let's ask them. I would really love to hear the Biden administration talk about why they haven't done that. It's hard to even get the question in front of them, right? I do think that there is a matter of, how many are we on there? We're 22 people on this call. Great. So, like a small number of people can have a big impact. But I don't think that the administration has been forced to address these questions by sufficient political action, will, media, everything else that forces political actors to do things. And so I think they have had the pandemic on their hands. Sure, absolutely, no question. But I think even for US domestic gun violence prevention, a lot of people are disappointed that they have not done more. And so, you can look back at the Biden administration where to the Obama administration where Biden was a player. And Biden was an architect of Plan Colombia, right? I mean, he was all in favor of militarizing the drug war, both domestically and internationally in the 90s. He may have pulled back on some of the militarization of the drug war domestically, but internationally, I don't see much of that. So, I don't think that his political philosophy goes very far. His politics go very far already in that way. So he has to be pushed. And there hasn't been sufficient push, either from Congress, from the media, or from people like us.
All right. And I also, we have a question, another question from Janet. Is Elliot Abrams still an envoy to Central America?
No. In fact, Kamala Harris has been assigned to some of that stuff. I'm not sure. I think there's someone else has been designated on Central America. Next month, Lisa can tell you, I'm sure. But no, Abrams is no longer the envoy.
I also want to point out that in addition to John giving a wonderful talk, answering questions, he also is managing to put things in the chat. So he did reproduce the slide, so it has the information about contacting members of Congress about in the House, about the Senate language. I'm going to turn it over to Marianne Perrone. And but before I do, thank you so much, John, for being with us tonight.
Thank you all.
Thanks, Rebecca. Thanks, everyone, but particular thanks to John. There may be other people who want to talk a little bit more with John, and we'll stay on afterwards for a few minutes to see. I'm just going to, without giving the whole rundown, if you look a little bit up in the chat, or a little bit back in the chat, all of our upcoming events are listed. And just, we've already talked about Lisa next month talking about the northern countries of Central America, but we have someone talking about El Salvador, about the border, someone who's written a book about the border, Todd Miller. I actually will be talking in May about Honduras, where there are many interesting and we hope exciting things going on right now with a change in administration. So do stay tuned, do come back each month, and the dates are there. And as you already know, because you've done it, you do have to sign up ahead of time with Eventbrite, and then the link gets sent to you. And it is free. If you want to donate, that really helps us, but it's not required. And please pass the word to anybody at all. So with that, I'm going to close this evening. And with, again, warm thanks to everybody. It's a tough time right now to care about people far away, and you all have done that tonight. We're all kind of trying to figure out whether or not to go to the grocery store, or what might happen, who next in our family might get the virus, or other kinds of things. And but you did that tonight. You came out to think about how our policies, how US policies, governmental ones, military, or commerce, affects other people in really harsh ways. And I thank you for that, and say good night.